Hello everybody and welcome back to my bench. Today I'm going to show you in detail how I tackle the Airfix kit of a true Cold War icon, the Handley Page Victor. Especially I'm building the K2 version as she appeared in the Operation Black Bag during the Falklands War. This aircraft is absolutely massive and the Airfix boxing is packed with detail, so I've got a lot of ground to cover. So let's kick things off. As per tradition, the build starts in the office. Now, with the bombers like this, you usually end up with a very limited view through those tiny windows. Most of this detail is destined to be hidden forever. But I really like these cockpit details and I still want her to look right. To give the kit the boost, I'm using the Calic 3D vinyl instrumental set. Before I can get to the fun part, I had to remove all molded on details and apply the base paint. Once that's done, I can start attaching the Calic parts. These aren't standard decals, they actually need to be glued in place. I'm using ultra glue from Ammo here. I prefer it because it's much more forgiving than super glue. It gives you time to adjust the fit, and if you really mess up, you can even remove the whole part later without any damage. Plus, any excess glue can simply be whipped away with a wet cotton swab. The details on these are fantastic, they look authentic and are worlds apart from the two basic decals Airfix provides. Moving on to the seats, the kit molded seat belts look way too thick and clunky for this scale, so I'm swapping them out for the Calic vinyls. Again, the first step is to clean up the plastic and remove those molded belts. After the base paint, I glued the vinyl set into the place. To really make the details pop, I added some dry brushing. I wanted to highlight the edges and create the look of realistic metalware. Then it's just a matter of putting the whole assembly together. Here is a preliminary test fit to see how everything looks once it's tucked into the fuselage. Honestly, a little sad that almost none of this will be visible once the canopy is on, but at least I have this video to remember that it's in there. While I'm in the zone, I'm also preparing the canopy and the front instrumental panel. They will be installed a bit later, but I'd rather have them ready to go now so I don't break the flow. Well, that cockpit was a great warm-up and gave me the spark I needed to tackle the rest of the details. Next up are the wheelbase and the gear legs. I started by painting everything aluminum and picking out the various mechanical details. I have to hand it to Airfix here. The engineering is very clever. The parts go together almost like Lego, which makes the assembly process really satisfying. However, there is a catch. The front gear leg has to be installed at this stage. I hate doing this early because it's a constant liability. You're always one clumsy move away from snapping it off, and it makes the masking a total nightmare later, but we'll come back to that. Compared to what's coming, anyway, this isn't even the biggest challenge of the kit. The main gear legs are nicely detailed and quite complex, but we do run into some ugly joints here. They definitely need to be filled and sanded. Simply scraping the seams with a knife or using extra thin cement isn't enough. This plastic is surprisingly hard. While the legs themselves have good detail, the wheels are basic, quite plain and missing the runners and manufacturer markings you see on the real aircraft. So I'm always looking for these small touches of realism. I picked up this Eduard 3D resin set to replace the kit parts. The history of Victor starts in 1950s. The Cold War was really starting to freeze over and Britain needed a credible way to deliver its nuclear deterrent. That led to the creation of so-called V4s, a trio of advanced bombers, the Vickers Violent, the Avro Vulcan and the Handley Page Victor. Of the three, the Victor was arguably the most technological ambitious. Its most striking feature was the crescent wing, a real masterpiece of aerodynamics. The result was an aircraft that could cruise at near sonic speed at altitudes where contemporary fighters were already struggling to air. While the Vulcan became the public face of the V-Force, many crews considered the Victor the better flyer, faster, highly efficient and capable of lifting enormous loads. With its sleek, futurist lines, it looked less like a traditional bomber and more like something straight out of the science fiction. In many ways, it was the ultimate expression of Britain's post-war aviation ambition. Now we move on to the part that truly defines the identity of the Victor, those massive sweeping intakes. A quick drive, it shows exactly what we are dealing with, the huge seam lines. This is a problem because Victor's intakes are supposed to be completely seamless. This is where the real work begins. But first I had to deal with these ugly ejector pit marks. They are right in the middle of the interior surface, exactly where they are the hardest to sand. After gluing the main parts together, it's time for the putty and the sanding and a lot of sanding. After 3 nights of dusty work, I finally arrived to an acceptable result. I sprayed the interior with the white primer, not just as a base but also as a check coat to reveal any scratches I might have missed. Once happy, I laid down a layer of Insignia white. It has that slightly yellowish worn tint that looks much more natural than a pure refrigerator white. I decided to paint the camouflage colors for these sections ahead of time. I wanted to save myself the headache of trying to mask deep inside the intakes once she's fully assembled. Just imagine trying to cut masking tape inside this giant airframe later. There's a panel line here, which probably shouldn't exist on the real aircraft, but it served as a perfect guide for placing my masking tape. For the paint, I'm using Mr. Color. Normally I'm a Mr. Paint fan, but their shades didn't quite match what I was looking for here. I'm using medium sea gray, and for the dark green I added about 10% yellow. It balances the color and prevents that harsh, high contrast look against the gray. With the interior done, we can complete the intakes by adding these pre-painted pylons. I finished the fans in steel and gave them a dry brush. Even though they are tucked away in the shadows of the intakes, I still want the detail to pop if somebody managed to catch the right angle. And here's a look at the completed intake assembly. The exhausts follow a similar process. Same dry brushing on the fans, but this time I used burnt iron for the overall color to simulate heat exposure. And finally we can mount the intakes and the exhausts onto the wing section. First I will prepare the air brakes, which I want to keep extended. Again, these are nicely detailed and need to be fully painted before they get buried inside the body. With all the internal sub-assemblies ready, it's finally time to close the fuselage. First goes in the front gear bay. Then the cockpit. And whatever you do, don't forget the ballast. The instructions suggest 25 grams, but I'm being more generous. I'd rather have a heavy model than a tail-seater. And the last piece to go in is the brake assembly. I'm keeping the wings off for now to make handling easier while I work on the fuselage seams. On the real Victor, these panels are seamless, so I'm back to my favorite hobby. More sanding. And here's a useful trick. If you want to check whether your sanding is actually finished, just paint the joint with a light metallic marker. It's faster than spraying primer and gives you instant feedback. If you still see a line, you're not done yet. I also had to clean up a few molding errors on the fuselage straight from the factory. Now we can install the front instrumental panel. According to the instructions, this happens now, fitting onto the two side pylons inside the cockpit. It's a very clever bit of engineering. I was wondering why I had not seen this step in anyone's build videos. It took me about half an hour of struggling just to find the correct fit. Very entertaining. At least the panel have now natural scratches. And with that we can finally close up the cockpit area. Moving on to the wings, first I need to remove these sections to allow the external fuel tanks used on the K2. Then I drill the holes for the tanks and the antennas. After putting the outer wing sections together and adding the winglets, I finally joined the wings to the fuselage. This is the moment when you realize just how huge she is. With a wingspan and length of around half a meter at this scale, I'm starting to wonder where I'm actually going to put her once she's finished. I even went to show the size of the kit to my wife at this point. She didn't throw me or the kit out of the house, at least not yet. This was actually a Christmas gift from her last year, and I did warn her, the plane was big. Technically the Victor K2 was a beast. Powered by 4 Rolls-Royce Conway turbofans, it could reach 0.92 Mach and carry well over 100,000 pounds of fuel, exactly what you want in a strategic tanker. But perhaps its most famous moment came long after it had officially retired. In May 2009, during a fast taxi at Brantingthorpe, a Victor known as a Teasing Tina accidentally became airborne. Due to a communication error between the pilot and co-pilot, throttles weren't pulled back in time and the old girlie simply did what she was designed to do. She lifted off the runway, climbing to around 30 feet before the pilot managed to wrestle her back down safely. It was a heart-stopping few seconds and a perfect reminder that even in retirement, the Victor still had plenty of life left in her wings. Not bad at all for a design that flew first in 1952. I'm also installing the refueling probe and the pitot tubes now, so I can paint them with the rest of the airframe. The kit is already a nightmare to handle on my bench, so why not to make it even harder by adding tiny, fragile parts that can easily be snapped off. The last thing to prepare before the paint are the external tanks and the refueling pods. There's a mountain of sanding waiting for me here, but I won't bore you with all of that. additional flavor of the sanding required on these intake to wings joints. And even after a coat of Mr. Surfacer grey primer, those joints still needed more work. And of course, all that sanding meant I had to go back and rescribe the panel lines I'd erased. Now for the entertaining part, the paint job, I started with some pre-shading to create a sense of wear and to keep the final finish from looking like a toy. I began with white on the main panels and then moved on to the lines. I used a mix of red, brown and black to keep the effect softer than pure black. The secret of these thin lines is a heavily tinned paint, low air pressure and fine needle, and getting the airbrush as close to the surface as possible. Time for the base colors. I'm starting from the bottom. I found several photos of the Victor showing the very front section of the nose in white, while the rest of the underside is light aircraft grey. I'm following these photos even though the instruction guide you toward the satin white belly. Next comes the camouflage. I've already laid down the walls of masking putty for the grey sections. I want to be careful not to completely bury my pre-shading here. And when it came time for the green, I made sure to mask grey entirely to avoid any unwanted overspraying on misting. The Victor service life is really a story of endurance and reinvention. It entered the Royal Air Force service in 1958 as a high-altitude nuclear bomber, finished in anti-flash white to reflect the glare of nuclear detonation. But the Victor's most important work actually came after its bombing days were over. When the Bayland Flint was grounded, the Victor was converted into Royal Air Force heavyweight tanker and quickly became the lifeline of the entire force. Its legendary status was cemented during 1982 Falklands War, but even then the old world wasn't finished. Nearly a decade later, Victors were deployed again for Operation Grandby during the Gulf War. Despite being among the oldest aircraft in the theater, the Victor K2 flew hundreds of refueling sorties with remarkable reliability, supporting everything from tornadoes to US Navy and the coalition aircraft. When the fleet finally retired in 1993, the Victor had spent more than 35 years as a backbone of British air power, proving itself versatile, dependable and absolutely indispensable. And the final bits of painting with aluminium. And then a quick gloss coat to seal everything in. I'm using microset under the decals and microsol on top to help them melt into the surface and conform to the panel lines. According to some sources, XH669 here is special because she was the final tanker meant to fuel Vulcan on that historic first raid. Even after her probe broke in heavy turbulence, her crew stayed in the fight, transferring every drop of spare fuel they had to another Victor to ensure the bombing run could proceed. Everything was going perfectly until I got to these orange invasion stripes. Someone at Airfix decided it was a good idea to give us decals for 2 stripes, but then tell us that the 3rd stripe has to be painted using Umbral Fire Orange. I'm recording this commentary some time after that moment and I still don't know how to talk about it politely. Basically it's absurd. You are never going to get a perfect paint match right next to a decal. Why not just print 3 stripes? Why? So I decided to ignore the decals entirely and paint all these stripes myself. First a layer of white to unify the surface and cover the camouflage. Then I build up 3 layers of orange. While that was drying, I worked on the rest of the decals. Now look at the unmasking. You can clearly see how different my painted orange is compared to the other orange used on the decal. I'm not happy at all with this. I decided to lightly sand it back to reduce the intensity and hopefully bring it closer to the decal shade. It's helped a bit, not perfect, but definitely better. And the decal drama doesn't even end here. Some of them started to silver even after multiple applications of microset and 3 full days of drying. I eventually hit them with Agama Hypersol, which is much more aggressive, so we need to be very careful with the application. And here's the result after a day of drying, or silvering, at least something went right. To finish this stage, I'm sealing the decal with gloss coat followed by satin varnish, because up next we get the weathering. Let's start with the oil paints. First I'm touching the panel lines with sepia diluted with odorless thinner. I'm aiming for a wash-like consistency and applying it quite generously. This goes not only on the airframe but also on the parts I've kept separately, like the fuel tanks and flaps. Once the paint has dried, I wiped off the excess with a paper towel. I want to keep the aircraft relatively clean. Bombers like this aren't exposed to the same extreme flight stress as fighter jets, and most of the fading from the tropical conditions on Ascension Island was already built in with the pre-shading and paint density. She already looks weathered, so I'm just adding some refined details. I added grime in the areas where dirt naturally accumulates, especially around the wing to fuselage joints and around the upper external fuel tanks. Operation Blackback is legendary in aviation history, but the Vulcan's raid on Port Stanley would have been impossible without Victor. To get a single Vulcan to the Falklands and back, the Royal Air Force had to solve a truly brutal logistic problem. Because Ascension Island was so far from the target, the mission required up to 11 Victor tanker sorties just to support one bomber. It became a complex daisy chain in the sky, tankers refueling other tankers, which then refueled the Vulcan, all conducted over the pitch-black South Atlantic and often under radio silence. Some crews were airborne for well over 15 hours, pushing both their aging aircrafts and themselves right to the limit. And that's more or less it for the upper surface. Let's move to the bottom. First some dirt on the T-tail under the stabilizers. Then I lighten few panels by spreading a bit of white oil paint, paying special attentions to the ends of the wing stripes, which I wanted to fade slightly more. Looking at my reference photos, there are visible streaks on the wings and belly from fluid leakages, so I'm replicating those here. And around the fuselage, I added some streaking from these panel anchors. Then a bit of heat staining around the engine nozzles. A good thing about the oil pans is that if you don't like the results or you messed something up, you can easily wipe them away and start all over again. And the main weathering is done. We can now finally start completing this bird. Relatively fast, as there are only few components left to install. First I'll add the central refueling signalization, but I need to paint the lights here first. Next come the legs and many wheels. First a bit of weathering. These aftermarket wheels from Eduard are very impressive. They even distinguish between front and rear wheels on the main legs and with a specific mounting detail. I love it. Even I'm not sure if anybody will ever notice them hidden under those massive wings. Once the legs are in place, I immediately install their covers. Little painting left. The pitot tubes needs to be finished in silver, and the head of a refueling probe gets a coat of chrome silver with a touch of wash to bring out the detail. So that's it. Many thanks for watching this iconic bird come to life. The build was definitely a challenge, and while I expected most of the struggles, those decals really caught me off guard. Now for the final challenge, finding somewhere to display her, because she definitely doesn't fit on my usual stand. I'm looking forward to your comments. If you like the video, please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss my future builds. Here she is, the Handley Page Victor from the Operation Blackbuck.